So I'm not exaggerating when I say that socialist calculation or economic calculation in a socialist commonwealth is one of the most important articles of the 20th century. And the reason is that Ludwig von Mises, in this article, did three things that, from the point of view of economic theory, are extremely important. First off, he completely destroyed the intellectual foundations of the case for socialism. Okay, we'll go through that. Secondly, it really also brought about a revolutionary breakthrough in our understanding of the importance of the price system in rationally allocating resources. So not only was it sort of a negative contribution to destroying socialism, but it was the beginning of an important breakthrough on how important monetary calculation of profits and losses and money prices, how important that is to economic efficiency and to the market economy in general. And third, what he did was he presented this theory of monetary calculation that sort of completed the revolution started by Karl Menger. Okay, the Austrian economists tended to talk about subjective values. They had a price theory, but none of them really went to the point where they brought the entrepreneur in and showed that the entrepreneur is sort of the pivot of the market economy, and what allows him or her to be such a thing is the fact that they can use prices to figure out the cost of production of any conceivable process of production. Anything that you can think of producing right now, if you have the technical knowledge about how to produce it, the so-called production function that we talked about, there are prices out there right now of all the factors of production. Every single type of capital good, every single type and skill of labor, you could find prices for it. You could add up the cost of production of that production process and then compare it to anticipated future prices. That's where, of course, the essence of entrepreneurship is, to figure out, in light of what present prices are for tablet computers, for oranges, for automobiles. Okay, we know what the present prices are, but the key skill of the entrepreneur is to figure out what they will be when his product comes onto the market, a month from now, 2 years from now. In the case of automobiles, the planning process from the beginning to end is something like 5 years. It used to be 7 years for American automobile companies and 3 years for Japanese automobile companies. But you are always producing for a future market. So not only do you have to know the present prices of automobiles, at least as a starting point, but you then have to forecast how supply and demand, how available resources and consumer values will change and bring about a change in prices in the future. So Mises sort of also developed that theory, okay, at least the germs, the beginnings of that theory in this paper. Initially, the first socialists writing in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, and those who have studied history of economic thought may know them, they're called the Utopian Socialists, the most famous of whom were Charles Fourier, a French person, a Frenchman, Henri Saint-Simon, also French, and then a Scot who came to the United States, Robert Owen. And they said a lot of embarrassing things, a lot of stupid things, a lot of things that could never exist in the real world. Okay? The classical economists said, well, we wouldn't have incentives under socialism to do all the things that needed to be done. And the Utopian Socialists replied, well, that's not true because we would have a different kind of socialist man that would be willing to do the dirty work or share it or whatever. So that was the state of the debate. It was pretty unsophisticated. Marx saw that. He tried to stop the debate altogether. And that's where Mises comes in, okay? So Mises abstracted even from the incentive problem. Mises said, look, assume that, everybody wants to be good socialists or whatever it is. The real problem is that there would be no way to know what to produce. It's a problem of prices. So his thesis, which comes through in the article that I'm talking about, is that the rational allocation of resources is impossible. He used that word in German. I don't know how to pronounce it, unmöglich or something. So it's impossible without economic calculation using actual market prices. So here's Mises' argument. First of all, socialism abolishes private property in capital goods and natural resources. All of the socialists, including Marx, wanted collective ownership of all the material factors of production. Not necessarily labor. They didn't want to enslave, or they said they did not want to enslave the laborer. He would be willing to work for money. But everything else would be collectively owned. Now, what's the second step? If everything is owned by one group or individual, okay, or controlled by one group of individual, the state is now the sole owner of all the material factors of production. They can no longer be exchanged. If one group owns all the steel mills, all the mines, all the types of machinery, all of the farms and farm equipment, okay, if you own all of those things, if one group owns it, there can't be any exchange. And of course, the next step, I mean, it's an exceedingly simple argument, but devastating. The next step is, without exchange, there can be no prices. Okay? And therefore, without prices, the state can't calculate the cost of production of the goods it produces. Right? You never know your cost of production. Without cost of production, you can never figure out profit or loss, what goods are more valuable, what resources are more valuable and what uses. And therefore, strictly speaking, a socialist economy is impossible in the sense that there is no way to rationally allocate resources. There is no way to know what a resource should be producing and how much of any particular good should be produced, what technology to use. This is why the Soviet Union and its satellites economically collapsed. Okay? So what Mises said about the essence of socialism, and these are his words, very interesting. He said, the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. If there's one will, there are not many different people evaluating goods and exchanging goods. There can be no exchange. It is immaterial whose will it is. It could be the nicest guy in the world. It could be a group of very, very smart scientists and engineers. It doesn't matter. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system. It's not a problem of knowledge. You have very smart scientists and engineers writing you out all the production functions you need to produce all kinds of different goods. You would never know what goods to produce and how to produce them in the most economical fashion. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of that. So with that, Mises destroyed the argument for socialism. The argument that socialism could be in any way efficient. And Mises pointed out these are the preconditions of economic calculation. You have to have private property in all stages of goods, not just consumer goods. Socialism would allow your ownership of your own clothing, maybe ownership of your own means of transportation, a small garden outside your house, but everything else would be collectively owned. Secondly, not only do you need ownership, but you need the freedom to exchange all kinds of goods and services. Not just vegetables, not just clothing, but steel mills, steel, software programs, and so on and so forth. Every single factor of production, every single input has to be exchanged and therefore have a price. And finally, he says there has to be a sound money, a money whose value is independent of political influence. Okay? So in a system where you don't have a sound money, and that's a system that we have today in almost every country in the world, you're taking steps towards socialism because you're causing calculational chaos. The money doesn't truly, unstable money or money that's inflationary doesn't give you a true accounting of costs and prices. So Mises concluded very simply, socialism destroys all three of these preconditions and therefore undermines socialist calculation and abolishes rational allocation of resources. So here's what happens in general. So the entrepreneur is right at the center of the whole process. Everyone see that? The entrepreneur has to do two things. First, he has to anticipate what the future prices of goods are going to be. Some goods aren't even in existence. The iPad wasn't in existence before 2010. So in some cases, you have to figure out prices for goods that are not even in existence, or the first cell phone, or the first electronic calculator that Texas Instruments, I believe, came out with in 1970 or 71. You have to figure out what prices people will pay. In some cases, you can depend on present prices, at least as a starting point. But in other cases, a wholly new good, you're going to have to, through an act of entrepreneurial imagination, figure out what the price is going to be. And not tomorrow, 2 years or 3 years down the road. It took a while to plan to bring the iPad out. Then, based on that, you and all the other entrepreneurs in the US have to take a second step. Based on the anticipated future consumer prices, you have to begin to bid for labor and land resources and capital goods. Okay? In doing that, and everybody bidding against one another, you then put a value on the means of production. A value in terms of cardinal numbers that can be added up, subtracted, multiplied, okay? That is money prices. And those money prices reflect what? They reflect the subjective values that consumers have and that determine the prices of consumer goods, okay? So the market economy is marvelous or miraculous in that it takes qualitative information. It takes subjective information and transforms it into objective prices, which can be added, subtracted, used to compare. Okay? So when you destroy that mechanism, everything becomes chaos. Now, let me just mention this objection to Mises. Socialists said, look, it's ridiculous. Okay, so in the 40s and 50s, they said, look, the Soviet Union has been in existence since 1917. And even to the 70s and 80s, they said Mises was wrong. I mean, because socialism wasn't impossible. Or yes, maybe it's inefficient. It's not impossible, though. But Mises had said in the very first article, he said, if you just have socialism in one country, it's like having a post office in the middle of profit-making business. Yeah, the post office is inefficient, right? I mean, it's bad service. You hate it, but it still gets the job done in some sense because it can copy prices and technologies from outside the government sector. Okay, so what Mises said was that's what the Soviet Union is like. Okay, and the Soviet Union, in fact, did act in that way. Their steel prices, their electricity prices, they use Western prices, okay? Prices for, for labor maybe even in some cases. But those prices didn't reflect the exact same scarcity conditions in the Soviet Union. They were drawn from other parts of the world. So they weren't the correct prices. So you still had shortages and so on, and you had increasing inefficiency, okay? And then there's all these stories about Communist China secretly sending away for Sears catalogs just to get prices for stuff, okay? So you had all these kinds of weird things. Also, the Soviet Union engaged in foreign trade, okay? They sold, energy products, coal and so on. So they had prices there. Also, each firm would have a quasi-legal guy who would go to the other firms because some firms had more resources than they could use, more wood. Another firm would have too many nails, so they would barter. So there would be barter prices. That was called blot. It was like sort of a bribery system where you would bribe another firm to give you what you needed. In exchange, you would give him or her what he or she needed. Okay, so the Soviet Union was kept alive by Western prices and bribes and so on, but that's still not economic calculation in the free market sense. So eventually, it had to break down. Okay. It was interesting that the CIA statistics at the time it broke down said that the Soviet Union was going to, was doing tremendously well. Okay, and they weren't. And Paul Samuelson, the great neoclassical economist, in addition in the late 1980s, I should have put this up, but showed that by early 2000, 2001 or 2, the Soviet economy would surpass the American economy in productivity. Okay, these guys actually believe this nonsense because they didn't understand Austrian economics. They didn't understand the function of the price system. They never read Mises' basic article, or if they did, they didn't understand it.